Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Meepolis and this is Literally Graphic. And today we are touching on Superman Red Sun by Mark Millar. Someone I apparently find so forgettable that while I read this book 2 times already, I had never realized he wrote this too. An Elseworlds tale published by DC Comics in 2004, Superman Red Sun is a speculative take trying to answer the question, what if Superman's spaceship landed in the Soviet Union instead of Kansas? The great American icon reimagined as a Soviet hero. Written by Mark Millar, penciled by Killian Plunkett and Dave Johnson, inked by Andrew Robinson and Walden Wong, colors by John Higgins and Ken Lopez on lettering. As I mentioned, I have already read this book before. The first time was back in the early 2010s before I felt too familiar with the characters in play, but the last time, way back in 2018, I felt pretty torn. I rated it 3 out of 5 stars, but with a lot of caveats. One of the things that came up over and over again for me was the lack of character development. But I've actually become more comfortable with that this third time through. A character over action kind of reader, this may be a surprising thing to say, but while it's not always true, I can see a reason why focusing on the speculative setting puts character development on the back burner. That said, the more I know of the characters, the very less believable the cardboard cutout of Batman is. Does Batman usually care about personal liberties? Not really. Does Batman generally hate Superman? Even less believable. How does Batman function without being a billionaire playboy? It's not like he has any actual superpowers besides being very wealthy and generally pretty confident. It would certainly make more sense for him to be working with Lex Luthor. Otherwise, the next biggest issue came to the portrayal of the apparently female characters and the rather rabid heterosexual agenda that's at play in this book. Why, for example, is Wonder Woman with Superman? This is nonsense. It's only rarely, if ever, employed. Certainly not stock for the character. And generally gives me the impression someone really has no idea what they're talking about. The last being my own personal bias, but hey, that's why people generally listen to me, for my opinion, that is. That said, Mark Millar does appear to construct some internal logic to why the two get together in this story, maybe. The reasoning behind the marriage between Lex Luthor and Lois Lane, while perhaps more generally a thing, seems completely illogical in this context. It's really only set up as part of the everything is backwards scheme, but nothing in the story itself actually points towards why they stay together. Unlike many other aspects of this book, I did generally enjoy the art. It was different. It felt like it reflected the general premise of the book. While I'm not against all things sexual, this book is decidedly unsexy, and that did at least mean that I didn't feel like the sidelines assumed female bodies were not also exploited for attracting what is generally referred to as the male gaze to their orifices. And moving on to a question I recently added to my reviews and still don't always refer to, let us look at, quote, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Because this is another way in which Mark Millar stretches out the caricature of the people he is portraying, and this time it's Superman and Lex Luthor. But first, let me say for the record that I'm not the biggest fan of the Soviet Union, but when people write superhero comics about what if the Soviet Union, they are not talking about just the Soviet Union, especially as the story continues and it becomes the world versus the United States. This is not just about the Soviet Union, and the portrayal of Superman as the leader of this anti-America also makes no sense. In any other continuity, do people stop wearing seatbelts because of Superman? This was the stupidest detail. Well, besides the fact that the seatbelt wasn't invented until mid-century and the first law mandating people wear seatbelts wasn't until 1970 in Australia. So there's a lot of time with Superman that people didn't wear seatbelts. Who actually thinks it's even possible for Superman to physically stop every bad thing that happens, even if he was part of some imaginary nanny state that would never actually happen? Also, as someone who doesn't believe in genius, I would like to call complete and utter bullshit on this iteration of Lex Luthor. It also doesn't make sense for capitalism to support the creation of any of the things attributed to Lex Luthor's defeating Superman. At least in his case, unlike in Batman's, Miller didn't try and pretend Luthor was not being fueled by a whole lot of wealth. Because wealth, particularly generational wealth, is the only thing that does make some people appear to be so-called geniuses. Class, much like gender, is totally flattened to portray only the important and powerful white and assumed cisgender and demonstrably heterosexual men. Race is ignored and excluded. While some characters are demonstrated to have weaknesses that Lex Luthor and other bad guys can exploit, we go beyond natural ableism, and Miller unsurprisingly centers only the super able-bodied. And after all that, no matter how highly my Goodreads friends have rated this book, and how I originally felt pretty torn about the whole thing, I just can't this time around. Not a fan of Kick-Ass either. I did find Miller's American Jesus slightly more interesting. Review coming by the end of the year, I think. But yeah, early 2000s Mark Miller and company gets 2 stars, both of which go to the art team. Bye y'all, keep reading and resist white supremacy. And as always, Literally Graphic is recorded on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation. I live here because of British colonization, indigenous genocide, and more geographically specific, Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, which was finalized in 1805 between representatives of the Crown and certain Mississauga peoples. This treaty was a lie and has since been broken many times over. Saying so reflects only my own small steps towards knowing the truth and does nothing for reconciliation.